Hi, everyone. My name is Enrique Menendez. I'm the editor-in-chief of Jing Daily and the Popular Times. Today, Jing Daily and SOTHEBY'S are excited to welcome you to our live event and conversation, How Popular Culture Has Redefined Luxury in China. We have a really great group of panelists with us today. Daniel Arsham, who's New York-based artist exploring the fields of fine art, architecture, performance, design, and film. We have Ted Gushue, editorial director of Type 7, which is the official Porsche magazine dedicated to architecture, design, exploration, and their intersection in the car world. We have Yuki Terase, who's the head of contemporary art Asia at SOTHEBY'S. Based in Hong Kong, she leads SOTHEBY'S auctions and private sales of contemporary art in Asia. So we have a 60-minute programming today. We're going to start off with a presentation from Daniel, and then following that, we're going to go into a Q&A session with our panelists. And at the end, we'll have about 10 and 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. You should have a functionality at the bottom of your screen that allows you to submit questions. And please feel free to do this at any point throughout the conversation. We'll be talking about popular culture and how it's intersected with luxury, and specifically what this looks like in the Chinese market and how Chinese consumers have taken part in this new wave. So to start off, I'll pass it over to Daniel.
Thank you, Enrique. So I thought I would start out, just by talking about a little of the collaborations that I've done in fashion space. I worked with Kim Jones on the collection for Dior for Spring Summer 2020, and my work has often overlapped with fashion in many respects. Is the slideshow working for you guys? Should be good. Yeah. Within my work, I've always looked for ways to allow it to reach larger audiences, and often that has involved the integration of third parties, whether it's a collaboration with Dior, collaborations with Adidas, collaborations with my friend Ted Gushue and Porsche. And I think that I've used that as a way to allow my work to engage with audiences that might not otherwise find my work through a traditional art gallery or museum setting. We've also done projects with Dior that allowed the kind of mixture of what you could say would be something that would be part of my universe, right? Part of my work, a kind of editions-based object, but being distributed and available through Dior's current channels. I've had a huge fascination with automobiles throughout my childhood and my life, and have worked on a number of sculptural projects that engaged with this kind of automobile culture. And I always found that, in terms of the way that we think about design as children, one of the earliest things that we can understand being designed is a car, maybe a car or sneakers, something like that. So I've often engaged that back into my work. Some of the pieces were more sculptural in nature. And in the case of this project, this is actually a fully functional car that I worked on based on a 1986 Porsche 930. And every aspect of this was altered in a way. Part of the inspiration for this was these kind of early 80s race cars. The original Apple computer race team from the early 80s, and the sort of livery design of that inspired much of the graphics here. But instead of brands on the exterior, I have the name of museums that I've worked with or galleries that represent me. So it's this kind of blending of those universes. And every detail of the car, as I said, was considered. This is also extended into some of my editions-based work to allow collectors from different parts of the world to engage with this work. And one of the desires for this project was to actually expand on this project, which was the first sort of drivable, let's say functional drivable sculptural project that I worked on, which was a little bit of a crazy project to try to convince, with Ted, the folks at Porsche to allow us to do this. But the project was a huge success. It ended up touring all over the world, had a major component of touring in China, as you can see in these images. And, I think really allowed people to engage with the object in a different kind of way. I've worked a lot in the music industry, collaborating with artists like Nas and Pharrell, and most recently, I worked with the Weeknd to create the anniversary of his 10 years anniversary album for House of Balloons. A full merch component that went along with that, kind of inspired by the blending of our two universes. And this again for me was always a way to allow my work to reach audiences that were kind of outside of a more traditional art audience. The two images here are from an exhibition that I did at How Museum in Shanghai, would have been 2019, and was an opportunity to present work on a much more monumental scale than I had exhibited before that. This is a kind of another aspect of my work that engages with architecture directly and allows these objects to kind of permeate the space and alter the surface of architecture. I've also engaged heavily with a kind of more art historical context, and many of these works will be seen in an upcoming exhibition that I have in China at UCCA Dune, which is opening in July, including a much larger bronze work similar to this piece. In further engaging in kind of popular culture, I was connected with Pokemon Company a couple years ago and presented an idea to work with them, not only to engage Pokemon universe in my work, but to also collaborate in their space. So I've created a number of sculptural objects that integrate, these kind of pop cultural elements back into my work. And this has taken the form of sculpture, as well as drawing and bronze works. Basketball has had a huge influence on my childhood, on my life in general, and created a number of works around this sort of universe. Really thinking about basketball as kind of a universal language. So when I make a piece like this, in some ways it can mean the same thing to a viewer as it might in New York, in Shanghai, or Tokyo. It's a kind of universal language. And I've used this as a vehicle in much of the work. This led to a very interesting collaboration. Last year, I was appointed the creative director of the Cleveland Cavaliers. This is a position that didn't exist within the NBA prior to this, and it's really a kind of recognition, I think, from really these larger brands that artists have a kind of influence on culture in a different sort of way. And so, definitely hoping to be able to bring some of this engagement with the Cavs to China at some point in the future. Yeah, they even let me make my own official Arsham jersey. Very interesting collaboration that I did with Ramoa a couple years ago, in which we created a kind of future relic version of the case that sat inside of one of their existing cases. And the advertisements that we did, which were wheat pasted all over the world, were these sort of vintage inspired ads, kind of in a way, kind of confusing the consumer as to whether this was a real project or not. Kind of collaboration with Adidas, which I engaged with for a number of years. Obviously, the footwear and sneaker kind of universe has influenced me a lot. I guess this would have been 2 years ago. I also did a project at Yohood and effectively created the creative direction for the entire festival there. This was a project with Disney for Mickey's 90th birthday. That was, I think this was at Intersect, 2019 maybe. And the most recent project, which Archive Editions did with Fortree, the television show on iQIYI. So one of the things I noticed when I did my first exhibition in China was that there was an audience there that was having difficulty reaching some of the editions-based work that I was creating in the US, partially because it wasn't available through channels like WeChat that were familiar to people in China. And so I founded a company called Archive Editions, which is solely based in editions available for that market, which are released exclusively through Archive Editions on WeChat. And they're kind of a mirror of some of the things we do with Arsham Editions in the States and Europe as well. Also some exclusive works. This piece was only available through Archive Editions, as well as a collaboration with UCCA. And kind of rounding this out, you know, this was the famous red packets that I did for K11 for spring earlier this year, which was a really interesting way to kind of create a gift that was given out to people during this celebration. And I think this is the last image in here. This image has not been seen before publicly, but this is the preparation for my first print edition that I'll be releasing through Archive Editions, which is based on a series of these moon paintings that I did a number of years ago. So we're preparing this now for release through Archive Editions shortly. Thank you guys so much.
Amazing. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now getting into, expanding a little bit on what you went over and some of our questions. To start off, we'd like to talk a little bit about the word popular, being that the title of this webinar is the intersection of popular culture and luxury. And I personally always find the connotation that the word pop versus popular can bring to be sort of interesting. And you touched on so many different areas of pop culture, popular culture. But when I think pop, I kind of first think of sort of bubblegum pop, but then there's, of course, so many different worlds that can go into, like Pokemon or, hip hop artists or whatever it is. And then we have, the word popular, which is, where pop comes from. And I always immediately kind of think of, Keith Haring, and there's a line in his journals where he said, the decision is basically, is art for an educated few, was art for all people of the time. So it really becomes, popular in the sense of who is it reaching and how. So I guess, maybe this is just my crazy way of looking at pop versus popular, but how do you sort of look at the word popular or pop? And I guess how do you see the earlier seeds of, popular art as early as we're all connecting to what we're talking about today?
Sure. I think there's definitely many different types of artists. There are artists who create universes that are sort of invented from thin air, and that are invented from a kind of a universe that they're creating, and many other artists who engage with the objects and material and experience of everyday life. And I think that much of the work that I make engages with things that people already know, right? So they have a sense about this thing. And in many ways, it allows them an entrance point into the work. Once they get there, things are unfamiliar. If you look at the Porsche project that I did with Ted, obviously we know this car, we understand them in a certain way, but there's something off about them. And once you get there, you're able to think about the engagement that I have with time, right? That there's a material transformation in the work. And it sort of opens up all these possibilities. And I definitely subscribe to this idea of this quote that you mentioned from Haring, where I do think that art should be for everyone. And I'm also able to engage at different levels, right? So the editions-based work, or even some of the merch and t-shirts that we've created with like Uniqlo, that goes from a $15 object, all the way up to a very expensive, work of art. And I'd like to play in this space.
Yeah, and so there's, I mean, there's when we're talking about the intersection of popular culture um, and luxury, there's sort of, you know, a paradox, and it's not really new because luxury has always had to succeed and sell off of, you know, playing to this idea of something that's exclusive, but also basically selling, you know, a lot of it. And we've seen different definitions of luxury. People have started to say uh, new luxury, and some of our work with Jing Daly's sister publication, The Popular Times, we've gone a step further and we've started to use popular luxury, which feels like kind of a logical jump. And for that definition, we kind of riffed off of what Herring said, and it's sort of, you know, luxury in all its forms is for all people of the time. But I guess maybe for Daniel or Ted, how do we reconcile this paradox in 2021, and is it even really, you know, a real thing?
I could say a few things. What's fascinating most to me is that 20 years ago, Porsche had never sold a car in China. 20 years ago, I'd wager that most residents of mainland China had never been to New York, had never been to Paris, had never been to many major cities around the world where artists like Daniel do their work. You know, these that timeline of 20 years of the opening up of China has, for me, as somebody who's worked in both the luxury space and the automotive space, been so fascinating to study because it's not like a very developed market like Europe. It's a hyper new experience that allows us as people who are creating things, artists like Daniel, car manufacturers like Porsche, to almost have an out of body experience as a brand, to see these things be consumed through people that truly had not been exposed. So I was speaking with a friend of mine who's a large customer of Sotheby's in Hong Kong and in mainland China the other day, and he was, you know, I was asking him about how consumer behaviors have changed in the art world, and he goes, "Man, 20 years ago, we the only art that people were buying were Ming Dynasty vases. You know, there was no cause, there was no Daniel, there was no artist like this that was being consumed. And because of the way in which the world has opened up and become global, now we're seeing that Porsche's largest market in the world is China. Some of Daniel's largest collectors are in mainland China. Some of the most important art collectors in the world are mainland Chinese. So it's there to say that it's been overwhelming to watch as someone working in that space is just is not accurate. It's probably the most fascinating phase shift that I think any market will ever see in the history of humanity.
Thank you. And I guess just staying a bit again on the idea, you brought this specifically into China and Porsche and you know the car show and all of that. I wonder, Dan, if you have any, and you did mention, you know, price, right, with there being a range of, you know, a Uniqlo t-shirt or something being, you know, very,
Yeah,
very
I think
expensive. And go ahead.
I definitely think that, at least from my perception, luxury has not necessarily been always about price. For me, it's really about two things: craft, right? The level of craft, and scarcity. So once you combine those two things together, you have something that's desirable and that has been made well, or that employs some kind of specific um, craftsperson who can do something that another can't. And I think when we apply this to sort of anything in the luxury market, whether it's art or, you know, vehicles or even travel, it's like, I think, you know, experiences are becoming a big part of that understanding as well.
And I guess then you talking a bit about, you know, luxury brands. How have and anyone can take this question, but how have luxury brands historically embraced markers of popular culture, and how does that, you know, look like, you know, today? And of course, you yourself have been involved with a lot of brands, but where is a brand's role, I suppose, today in embracing popular culture?
In the car world, car manufacturers have been patronizing artists I mean, geez, since the 1950s and 60s. I mean, you would see Andy Warhol did BMWs. You name the artist, they have all been involved with car manufacturers at any one time. And some of the earliest conversations I had with Daniel around what turned into the 992 project were about how this legacy had really not been adopted by Porsche. They hadn't really patronized the arts the way that their competitors had. And so this was sort of a return to form when we brought that project to life. And I think this is, this is just the beginning of what we'll see brands like Porsche doing, because they realize now that you have entire generations of people that aren't necessarily focused on transportation, but they need to be in a way for these companies to keep existing. So the fact that Daniel might have an audience of young people who live in urban environments that might not even have a driver's license, but all of a sudden are now dreaming about a Porsche 992, it's a huge win for everybody, because it achieves the goal of the car manufacturer, and it also, much like Daniel was saying, it exposes his work to a potential new audience that is just unfathomably powerful.
Yeah. And Ted, do you think that car manufacturers need to sort of step into that space to compete? And I think it's interesting to think about, because we sort of see it in the luxury fashion space, where it's like Dior, Vuitton, or whoever. It's all kind of about the collaborations and how they're innovating. And it seems like Porsche sort of stepped ahead by doing this with Daniel. Do you think it's kind of has to happen for cars to try to reinvent themselves?
I'll give you a figure that's quite interesting, that really shocked me the first time I heard it, and that is 65 cents of every dollar spent globally every year on advertising is spent by an automotive manufacturer. It is the largest per dollar spend of ads in any industry globally. So when an auto manufacturer chooses to partner with someone like Daniel, it's in many ways perhaps not as flashy as Daniel partnering with Rimowa or some of these more luxury brands, but the scale at which they operate and the infrastructure behind their operation is just so staggering that it has the ability to achieve things that are likely not possible with just the fashion space, or just the just the luxury, like the watch space, for instance, another space that Daniel also plays in. So I think, Daniel, you'll probably echo that sentiment. I mean, there's few people, I mean, few clients that you would work with that are capable of chartering planes to fly cars around the world.
Yes, this is true. When they came with the idea, because the first concept of the 992 was, we unveiled it actually at Selfridges in London, and it was part of a kind of exhibition that I had done there. When that was over, the intention was that it was going to go to the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart, and it would sit next to the most well-known Porsches from history. But there was interest from Porsche China, from Porsche in Singapore, from Porsche in France, and they decided to kind of create a world tour for the work. And in some ways, I'm familiar with this idea of a traveling exhibition, so having artworks that actually move from place to place. But moving a car is a very different proposition in that way.
This is definitely
limits? Oh, God.
I was just going to say, the only other person I could think of that would understand this as well as Daniel or I would be our friends at Sotheby's, who are the masters of relocating comical amounts of artwork globally.
Yes. Yeah, 2020 kind of expedited the whole sort of direction. I think it's very interesting to hear what Ted and Daniel were saying now, because we see exactly the same pattern in our art as well. China is just, everything about China and Chinese collectors is just so eye-opening, and it's so different from anywhere around the world. Almost, I would say 90% of Chinese clients that I deal with, for example, are aged under 45. They use mobile phones to sort of look through art. They decide on purchasing these artworks through JPEGs and PDFs, digital world, without really seeing the works in person. it's just fascinating that, for example, last year, because every entire world was locked down, more like, so 40% of the new in Asia, we saw 40% of the bidders and buyers were actually new to us, and we had a very overwhelming number of new clients, especially out of China, sort of coming, browsing ourselves, browsing our marketplaces, becoming clients of Sotheby's, and it's just been, I think it was the direction that we were heading already, but last year probably expedited this whole direction of sort of young, vibrant market in China, sort of exploding with so much interest in art and luxury.
And
I have
when we're good.
one question that just kind of came to my mind is how much of the clients that you're experiencing that are new clients that are under 45, who I have to assume are the product of the one child policy of the Chinese government that allowed families to have one child that could be really focused on and kind of adored and perhaps even spoiled to the point where they could become art collectors, which is not something you might necessarily see so much in a Western culture.
Right. I think that there are briefly two types of clients. One is, as precisely described, sort of children of wealthy families, second generation, third generation of business empires who've now sort of reached the age where they can spend a little more freely on these art and luxuries. And there's another group of sort of entrepreneurial people who have, sort of built their own corporations, IPO'd, at the age of 30, 35, became billionaires, and they've started to sort of collect and look at art. So I would say there are two, it's not just China, but more so in China, I'll say there are two sort of types of groups, and that's very interesting to observe.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Daniel, when you're creating for the Chinese market, do you ever differentiate in what you create? I know, of course, you talked a bit about archive editions. Maybe you want to talk a little bit more about that, but how much of it is I'm creating for a global audience, and how much of it is localization?
No, the work is created independently of the audience. So the idea behind the work should function cross-culturally, cross-language, right? This for me is in some ways the point of art in general, is that it becomes a language that can be spoken without any need for translation. And so when I'm thinking about creating, a body of work or an exhibition, it's really focused on the ideas present within it, and it should work if I show it anywhere, right? In China or in Europe or the States. One thing I was going to say just about the collectors and the level of interest is that, I've worked with Emmanuel Peretzin, my gallerist, for almost 20 years now. And the gallery started in Paris. He has a gallery in New York now, and a number of galleries in China, one in Hong Kong, one in Shanghai. And I think that the collector base from that, as Yuki mentioned, yes, is quite young, but it's also the price point of things is less relevant than the desirability around it, or the scarcity around it. So as an example, we have clients that own major works of mine that are, massive bronze works. And, we had a release a couple of days ago of an edition, and I got a text from one of them. It was an inexpensive, object, and he would just wanted to make sure that he could get access to that one. And so it's not really about price point. I think it's really about craft and access, as I said. And I think that's why you're seeing things operate at many different scales.
And Yuki, I suppose from the auction house, perspective in terms of the scale of products being sold, how is that something that you're, approaching now, and that may have shifted?
So, for example, 2020, Sotheby's held over 500 online auctions, as many physical auctions as you can imagine, and out of top 20 most expensive artworks, for example, 10 lots were bid by Asians and 9 were bought by Asians, not just Chinese, but predominantly Chinese clients. And the presence of Asian clients, Chinese clients in the entire Sotheby's is just growing very rapidly, especially from last year when the COVID started, and everybody's desire to collect and sort of tap into this world has become very explosive, I'd say. So for example, 2017, until 2017, in other words, in Hong Kong, in contemporary art sales, we were not selling any Western international artist works in our auctions. And then in just the short time of 4 years, for example, our latest sales that's coming up in 10 days time has got 50-50 percentage of Western and Asian artists. So I think the demand and sort of the collector base growing is so rapid here, and that's just not comparable. You know, it's compared to the rest of the world. There's no place like this at the moment in Asia.
Is there anything that stood out to you over the past few years, something that, you know, sold that you feel like really encapsulated this intersection in a way that just blew others out of the water?
So I think it's already made public, so I think it's okay to mention. But last year, the most expensive painting that we've sold at Sotheby's entirely globally was the triptych by Francis Bacon. And it was bought by our colleague on the phone with a client in New York, but was direct underbid by a Chinese client who was online bidding. And it sold for, I think, $80 million. US dollars around. So it was sort of the fact itself, it made a headline of a Chinese client online bidding for the most expensive work sold at Sotheby's. That was, I think that's a very simplistic event of the year that summarizes how sort of the power of China and its eagerness to collect has come to this point.
Cool. And you know, in terms of other products, like let's say, you know, sneakers that have become essentially auctionable.
Yeah.
Is that, how has, you know, being on, you know, I suppose on the inside of, you know, from an auction house, is that something that just really came out of, you know, left field? And you know, Daniel, of course, has had a little bit to do with creating sneakers and, you know, in a way that have become so so valuable. But it's really when we look at, you know, the trajectory that luxury has taken, you know, and over the past 10 years, really, it's just gone to this place where it kind of goes against what traditional, you know, luxury, you know, stood for, which was not about sneakers. So how has that been, you know, to sort of see, you know, happen? And maybe Daniel, how has it been to make that happen?
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, because today I was sort of browsing SOTHEBY'S.com and realized that on the top page, of course, you have this fine art auction schedule, but also you have this marketplace where you see the handbags and sneakers and all these collectibles on the landing page of SOTHEBY'S.com, which probably we would not have imagined the page would look like this a few years back. Just to give you an example, I did a collection auction of Japanese designer Nigo back in 2014, and one of the items that he insisted that we include out of his collection was this sneaker, Adidas Stan Smith, with his portraits on it. And at the time, there was a whole debate about, should Sotheby's sell a pair of sneakers? You know, is it relevant? Is it appropriate? You know, all these sort of arguments about, you know, what Sotheby's should handle. This is a fine art auction house with like 250 years of history. Should we sell the sneakers? And that was 2014. Yes, it's 7 years ago, but it's only 7 years ago. And then fast forward from last year, 2 years ago, we've started to sell these sneakers you know, without any hesitation, and then no one doubts at Sotheby's about selling these things. At the moment, we have a lot of really serious art collectors looking at our website saying that, oh, you know, I've seen this basket that I'm very interested in, but I also see this pair of sneakers that I also found on your webpage. Can you send me details? Like the people are just like not discriminating what they want to look at. It's just like sort of whole boundary has become much more blurry, I think, in recent years.
Yeah, and when, you know, when we kind of look at, I always, when we look at the timeline of, starting with popular art, and it's, back to the 50s and whatever, 60s, 70s, and to see fashion basically, fall into that same mindset, which, we said earlier, this idea of popular luxury. And it's kind of, I see fashion as being the last of the bigger cultural or creative kind of outputs to shift, because obviously art has been doing this for several decades. And music, of course, pop music itself, it's very it's so tied into that. And then fashion was sort of the last domino to fall, where really is, it's the physical manifestation of someone looking elitist, right? It was created by luxury. It was created by luxury conglomerates, and that's basically has been completely thrown out the window, where it becomes much more difficult to differentiate, elite versus popular. And I suppose alongside, that blurring, and Daniel, again, you were very early on to start, looking at sneakers in this way, and I know it came from an authentic place to you, for you. Is there, do we even imagine what this will look like in, 10 years, given how, quickly the reality of luxury has changed over the past, only 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to open up space for younger designers and other designers to kind of enter that space. But if we think about sneakers, for me, it was just something that was part of my childhood. Jordans. The first pair of Jordans that I bought with my own money was Jordan 3, and I have a very specific memory of that kind of era and that moment. And in a similar way to my fascination with cars and Porsche specifically, when you touch a car from a certain area, or when you drive it, it's almost like this weird time machine where you get into this thing and everything about it has a particular essence to it. And I think sneakers have a very similar language to that, right? Even if they're reissues of something older, they marry to a particular moment in time. And this is certainly something interesting for me in relation to my own work, in thinking about how time influences the way that we think about objects, and also give them value as well.
Daniel, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So with a culture like China, which previously, like for instance, you couldn't buy a Porsche legally in China up until 2001 or 2002. So
yeah.
These are cultures where potentially a customer of a piece of your work that is based on a Porsche would not have that childhood memory, theoretically, and instead that they've somehow, but they still might share the passion. So the passion comes from a different place. Is it because they've come to your culture and they've seen your passion for it, and then they bring it back, they re-import it back to their own? Or how do you see them interpreting something that doesn't share that childhood touch point?
Sure. I mean, the interesting thing is obviously Porsche is a German company, so it's really a kind of German expression, right? And when you talk about the first 911 that was sold, the first Porsche 911 that was sold commercially in China was the 996, which we're getting very specific, but it was a very particular car. It was the first for the rest of the world. It was the first in a new era of Porsche. And I've actually done a bunch of research on this, because this is the 20th anniversary of Porsche in China this year. And so they're going to be doing some events and things around this. And I don't know if there's any Porsches on the ground in China that predate because of the existing laws there for automobiles. Probably very difficult to import. But when I released the edition of the 86 930 Turbo, I think that there was some kind of interest there. I don't know whether, obviously that car doesn't exist on the road there, but I think it's when these objects become so indelible in the global culture, whether it's through film or through some other kind of means, like people are familiar with that car and the shape of that car. So it works.
I guess you could say the same. You could say the same for Jordans. Perhaps they weren't available, but the people understand. I think humanity is very quick to see when something is powerful. they gravitate towards it, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
They do a lot of homework, they do a lot of research themselves. The speed of their learning is just incredible. Like I have a lot of clients who've not bought a single piece of art 3 years ago, and then 3 years on, like they tell me what I should be looking at in the market, who's hot, what kind of artists are interested. I mean, like, the speed and the desire to learn is just so incredible in China.
Yeah.
And I guess that's something that's changing, as well in China and globally. And Ted, you talked about availability, and with digital, the amount of information that everyone has access to makes things shift so quickly. And in a sense, it feels like everyone knows exactly what's happening. And how do you find that's something that has helped your work, Daniel? Because obviously there's still a way to maintain exclusivity, even though everyone knows exactly what's what it is. And of course, with NFTs and memes and all this stuff, it's entering even another another realm of craziness.
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit before about how there are certain elements of global culture that are kind of universal. I would say, like, basketball for me has been one of them. Automobiles have been another kind of language that I think people inherently kind of understand, and I find those useful, particularly as some of my own work is really about a fixation on our understanding around time. So I've made these future relic kind of objects that appear as if they've been projected into the future. And in order to create a conversation around them, I also need to locate them in time. So a basketball, we all understand it being from this sort of relatively current era. And when it's made in a new material like crystal and it's kind of degrading, we have this inherent sense that it's from some kind of future, right? But it also feels like a relic from the past. And that confusion around the work, its position within history, is kind of that is the artwork, that is the content of it. And I'm looking always for these universal kind of links for people to grab onto and kind of have an in for the work.
What would a future relic NFT look like?
I mean, every single conversation that I've been having with everyone for the last month has been around this, and it's certainly I think it's a very interesting technology for a number of reasons. One of the most interesting things about it from the artist perspective is part of the way that the smart contracts in this work, artists are able to actually recover a portion of the resale of their works, right? So this can go towards funding new projects or things like that. But I think it's definitely in early stages, and I'm finding it interesting just to watch and kind of see what's going on in that space.
Sorry, I was muted. And Yuki, from the auction perspective, with what you're seeing, or is there any approach to
Yeah,
fungibles?
we've announced this collaboration with the NFT Artist Pack, and we'll be releasing a series of NFT art with the artist on Nifty Gateway. I think, as Daniel said, this is something that's very interesting for sure. Everybody's sort of trying to figure out what it exactly means to on the long run. What does that mean to sort of unique objects that exist? Is it all about digital art? Is it going to be linked up with the physical art, like the painting behind me? Is it going to be sort of data-based with the blockchain? There are a lot of questions, but I think what's great about this is the whole sort of again, I'm going back to the pandemic experience, but it's the whole experience sort of made people realize that for me, like, among all the creative industries, for example, fine artists have not had so much power or self-branding, method of like expressing themselves as much as, for example, compared to musicians or actors. No one buys a musician's a new album because of the label that they belong to. But it wasn't the case with the fine arts, where sort of gallery system and art fairs and all the auction houses, the platforms and the boxes were driving forces. And then now I think this NFT is sort of, in a way, bringing back the power to the artists and creators themselves and linking up directly with the owners. And I think the concept itself is very fascinating, interesting subject.
It's also super interesting that, digital art in general and film and video has always been difficult to collect. There's been incredible, artists. I can think of an artist like Tipolati Rist who, makes these works that have, a similar importance to many physical sculptures. And I think that in terms of the NFT space, the thing that I'm looking for, which I haven't really seen yet, is the use of the medium in a way that can create something that didn't exist before, right? Much of what we're seeing is like a two-dimensional image or a short video that's just been put on the platform. But theoretically, it's something that could exist in a gallery space or even on the web before that. I think that there's a lot of potential in the smart contract capabilities, on the Ethereum blockchain that haven't been used yet. And when the medium becomes part of the work, this is where it will get very interesting.
Definitely. Yuki, you mentioned something, you said, about sort of the, the power it gives the artists themselves. And it's, is very much the power of the internet. And I think what we've seen, one of the big shifts in the past 10, 15 years is that consumers really can take power into their own hands. And we've seen that go into different areas with, the Wall Street Robinhood sort of takedown, where a bunch of, Redditors essentially, spiked and manipulated a stock. And
I mean, it's interesting because I'm sure Daniel gets like 2,000 DMs from collectors around the world every day, but I know that a lot of collectors, like large or small, they often get in touch with the artists that they found on internet, like on Instagram, saying that, oh, this artist is very interesting. They don't even have a representing gallery, but I'd be interested in purchasing. Send a DM. They purchase the work directly, like sort of from the artist to the collector. That happens a lot, and I think it has sort of gradually happening. And then over the last year, because everybody's just stuck at home, spent a lot of time on the phones and computer, it expedited. Like it just really happened much more, maybe at the speed of like 5 years. And density, and I think that's very interesting phenomenon. And then I think the NFT concept, which already existed from a few years ago, but then kind of came in at the right time when everybody was just like stuck at home looking for new ideas, new way of expressing, medium, everything else. I think it wasn't the new technology, it was already existing already from a few years ago, but it just came at the right timing when everybody was just like shifting towards going direct with the artists.
We saw the same thing in the car market and in the secondary car market. We expected initially, I was on phone calls with Porsche marketing at the beginning of this whole crisis, and we stopped all spending because we thought everything was going to go so south. And in reality, everyone sat at home looking at cars to buy for when they could go on road trips the second this was all over. So every used car dealer I know had a record year. It's really, there's a lot of power when it comes to us all doing nothing except looking at our phones.
Completely. I think we had the record private sale volume as well at Sotheby's last year. So I guess the first.
And nobody's spending money on plane tickets or hotels, so we have a lot of extra cash sitting around.
So we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you again so much to our panelists, Daniel, Yuki, and Ted. Thank you to the teams, SOTHEBY'S and Jing Daily, for all the work on this behind the scenes. And keep on the lookout for a wrap up from Jing Daily and an article, just sharing key takeaways and a recording of the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.